Okay, hi everybody. So there's one last little piece to do in this basic intro to JavaScript and to client-side scripting, and that is we've looked at the basics of the language. We've looked at how to write functions that do things to the DOM, and we've also looked at how to get functions hooked up to events so that we can now basically treat a web page like a graphical user interface. So when the user clicks on things, there are JavaScript functions that execute and do stuff in the background to change the view that the user has, so to change the page. So we've got pages that are dynamically changing without ever going back to the server. So let's talk about the next step, which is forms. So this is the kind of the last thing. There's a couple of reasons why you might want to worry about forms with JavaScript. And if we go to, I have a couple of examples loaded here. This is just an example from some site called econsultancy.com, but I thought I had some good examples on it. You guys have seen forms like this before, so take a look at this form here. The user is signing up for some new service, and as they type, they're getting a little indicator out here telling them whether the user ID that they've typed is available or not. Over here, they start typing a password, and they're kind of told, you guys have seen this before, they're given messages here about whether their password strength is weak or excellent or good or whatever. Sorry, in both of these cases, there are JavaScript functions that are linked to keystroke events. So when the user clicks into one of these forms and starts typing, each time they type a new letter, a JavaScript function takes over and evaluates what they've typed, retrieves it from the form, and then runs a little algorithm on it and gives them its opinion, for example, of how strong their password is. This one here would require a database lookup, so that requires Ajax, which is coming in the next module, but the initial part of this would be done through JavaScript. So if you want to do this kind of fancy form validation, you need to be able to attach event listeners to form elements, and you need to be able to retrieve things from form elements and so on. And the rest of it is just design. So they've made it so that these form elements are nicely justified here, and then there are maybe some divs or some paragraphs hanging out over here that they can grab and change and fill in with content in order to show messages. So the functionality is just you read the password, you do some algorithm on it, and then you put out a message. The rest of it is CSS and HTML and stuff. Here's another example. So you got a big long form, and as you go, you're getting visual indications. So here they're changing CSS properties like border and color. They're also changing inner HTML of an element over here. They're changing the source attribute of images here, but it's all linked to a form. Here's a really nice one. The user types Graham at gmail.com. Did you mean Graham at Gmail? All of that stuff. Anyway, all of it comes down to being able to hook up event listeners to forms. So that's one reason why you might want to hook up event listeners to forms in JavaScript. It's to give you a much nicer and more user-friendly and customizable type of form validation that goes well beyond the built-in form validation, where it waits till you hit submit and then it gives you an error message. Here's another example. You may also want to create a standalone JavaScript app. I couldn't find any that were kind of simple enough and using forms that were kind of cool. I found this one. It's just a very simple little app. It's a dice roller. You can see there's form elements here, and when you hit rerun, when you press that button, a JavaScript function fires, which does some little animations and generates random numbers and displays them like this. But it's also reading these form elements. So if I say I want to run, I want 10 six-sided dice, when I hit rerun, it reads the contents. So here we're using these form elements as input to a JavaScript program, which is then changing what it does. I can make these three-sided dice. They don't change the way they look, but now I only get numbers from 1 to 3, and so on. So that's the idea of a standalone JavaScript app. Same problems as form validation. You need to be able to retrieve form elements, you need to be able to attach listeners to them, and you need to be able to read their contents. And in some cases, you may want to respond to change events like this, or keystroke events like this. Okay, So that's what we want to do. That's where we're going. And there is a set of code in the sample code for this week in a folder called Form Examples. And if you run it, this is what you get. So I'm actually not running this through localhost. I should probably do that. Localhost / I think it's week 3 stuff is where I put it. Am I running? I am. Go to htdocs. Oh, it's module 3 stuff, not week 3 stuff. Sorry, module 3 stuff. It's in the module 3 code that you get online, and here are the form examples. So this is the folder, and it's a working example of a bunch of stuff. So you'll notice if you open the console here, things to try. So click into the user ID. If I enter a name and then click away, nothing happens. But if I leave it blank and click away, it gives me an alert here. Alert, so now there's 2 of them. User left the user ID field blank. So that's hooked up to an event, the event of me leaving the form element. What else? If we change the name or change the age, as it goes up and down, you can see it's responding. So I've done most of what would be required for some kind of form validation or form input. I have hooked up these fields to events. Those events are causing functions to fire. What I'm not doing is changing the DOM in response, and that's actually left for an exercise. There's a couple of other things here as well. If I unclick gaming, it says alert, the user says they don't like gaming. If I submit, with my name Sam in there, it says form submitted for Sam. Sam seems cool. Notice it didn't reload the page or anything like that. The submit button has been kind of usurped here. It doesn't cause a request to get sent anywhere. If I unclick gaming and hit submit, it says form submitted for Sam, and then it gives me the warning again. Sam doesn't like gaming. Sam doesn't seem so cool anymore because he doesn't like gaming. Okay, so a few things. If we go over to the guide, the first thing that we need to talk about if we're going to do any DOM manipulation and any event handling with forms is retrieving the form elements. So I'm going to mostly work with this pre-baked example today because we have all of the basics. We're just adding a few extra things in. So let's do it through this form here. I'm going to inspect this form. So we're actually looking at the DOM over here. We're not looking at the page source here, we're looking at the DOM, but we can see everything we need to see and we don't have to switch pages. So you can see that the form has an ID of example form. So I could use getElementById to retrieve that form. The input elements also have IDs. So this one is user ID. Where are we? This one has an ID of age. This one has these ones have IDs, these checkboxes here. So these are type checkbox, which we haven't looked at in class before, but they just cause a little box to appear there, which you can check and uncheck. And you see they've all got CB, which stands for checkbox. This is the gardening one, the skiing one, the reading, and the gaming one. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 form elements if you count the submit button down here. Okay, and then there's a little bit of styling to make them look the way that they do. So the first thing I want to talk about is retrieving form elements. Since I've given them IDs, I could just do getElementById. But sometimes we don't give them IDs. Sometimes it makes more sense to give them names rather than IDs. And when you have an ID or a name, there's a special object inside of document. So document.forms gives me a collection of forms that are available to me. So I only have one form on this page, so I can access it through item 0. That gets me to that form. Or I can use its ID or its name. So if it has either an ID or a name attribute, I can access it this way. And then within that form, I can, for example, get the gardening checkbox by name as well. So this is kind of, in some ways, it's kind of nicer than using getElementById, but getElementById works just fine too. So let's get the text box here. So its ID is user ID. So I can go let tb, or let, I don't know, yeah, tb for text box equal document dot forms dot example form dot user ID. There we go, I got it. Okay. Now, one of the main things I'm going to want to be able to do here, I'm going to want to be able to use TB to add event listeners. So there's that. But I'm also going to want to be able to retrieve what the user has typed. And you might think that that's inner HTML, but it's not. Input elements are empty elements. They don't, what it means to be an empty element is, if you look over here, the form element has a start tag and an end tag, and then it has stuff inside of it. So that's not an empty element. The label element here has a start tag and an end tag, and it has some contents. Input elements don't have end tags. So they're a special class of elements like image elements, and there's a couple of other like BR and HR. They are empty elements. Even though we think of them as having contents, they don't, in this technical sense, they don't have any contents because there's no ending tag and there's nothing in the middle. They don't have that. What they do have, which is the thing to think about, is what attribute would I use to set a default value in here? Let me think about that for a second. Well, I would set the value attribute. So I can access their value attribute to get what the user has typed. So once you have retrieved the element, it's the value attribute, and you can also set it to something else. TB value equals Joe, sets it to Joe over here. Okay, so that's a fundamental thing, and you can use this with most input elements. You could use it with the age element as well. So that one has an ID of age, obviously. So I can go document.forms.exampleform.age.value, and that gets me the number typed in there, and I can set the value to something else. That's a little closer to my actual age. I can even set it to something like that. But it's not going to like it because Chrome's gonna get involved and prevent it. So I get a warning here. Okay, so I can set the value to 50, and there it is. But notice when I get the value back, by the way, it comes back as a string. So every element that lets you type things into it, or whether and that includes the color element and stuff like that, the value you're going to be getting back is of type string, and that's important because if I want to be able to, for example, why don't we add an event listener? So I'm going to go let a, that's for the age, equal document.forms.exampleform.age. So that gets me the thing, and then I'm going to go add event listener. Now the event listeners that we have before aren't going to be super helpful here. So click and stuff like that aren't that helpful. There are a bunch of new events that are specifically for forms, and the first one I'll show you is change. So whenever the form changes, okay, so when the value inside the form is changed, it's going to set off this function, and for this function what I'll do is I will say console.log this, because that I can use this to reference the item that I've got, .value plus 10. So let's say I'm doing a little bit, I want to use this as a number. I want to add 10 to it. Okay, so now I've got an event listener. Now whenever this changes, I now have two event listeners, two change event listeners, one that was already there in the form that tells me what's going on, and then this one, which was supposed to report the value plus 10, but you can see that it hasn't done that. So a.value is 54. I can do a lot of arithmetic with that. If I did times 10, it would work, because of weak typing, it would convert 54 to a number and do the multiplication. But if I do plus 10, it does concatenation, because JavaScript, plus can mean concatenation or it could mean arithmetic. JavaScript makes the choice in this case to convert both to strings and do concatenation. It prioritizes concatenation over addition. So what I really need to do if I want to do something like this is I need to use one of the built-in functions to convert. And in JavaScript they are parseInt and parseFloat. So parseInt a.value gets me, you can see that's no longer a string, that's an integer, so now I can add 10 to it. So that's what I would have to do in this, actually let me reload to get things back to the way they were. In this event listener here, I would have to go parseInt this value plus 54. Oh, I forgot to do Forgot to retrieve the element. There we go. I have to let a equal the age form, and then I can add the event listener. And now as the age goes up, it's working now. I'm getting 33 for the last one, 23 plus 10. Okay, so there's one possible event listener. One thing to note though is that this event listener, it doesn't fire when you might normally want it to. So the change listener doesn't fire while I'm typing. There is another list, so there's actually, I've got this hooked up to a different listener, not the change listener. If you press these buttons here, the change listener that I just added will fire. But if I'm just changing it manually in here, it's not until I leave the text box that I just tabbed away from the text box that the change event fires. So that may or may not be what you want. If you want to go on every single keystroke, the best way to do it, there is an input event, but the best way to do it is probably with key up. But you can do it with input as well. So if I go document.forms.exampleform.user_id, that gets me that. I can go t.add event listener. I can do it this way, input, function, console.log, this.value, okay, like that. Now, whenever I type in here, whenever anything happens in here, it fires that event. And so this is the kind of thing that you would do like this with, you know, password checking, password strength checking, and stuff like that. I'm going to reload to reset. I'm going to get the form again, the form element again. The other one that you might use is a keyboard event. There's key up and key down events. So one that's typically used is key up, which more or less behaves the same, except if I hold down a key, it's not until I lift it up that the event fires. Whereas with input, it's going to fire on every single F being added in there. Here it's going to wait until I key up. But that does most of what you want to do as well. Okay, so a few new events, key up, input, and change. Let's see where we're at in the guide. So we talked about retrieving things, which you can retrieve by name. So in this case, there's a name field. So this would work. Document.forms, regform retrieves the ID here, and user ID retrieves the input here. So you can do that by name or by ID, and that's handy in case, so you don't have to do both. And you can also index in. So you can say this would give me the second form and the first input element in the form. But it's, I think in practice, it's much handier most of the time to do this. Okay, reading form input. Once you've got the element or the node, so if I've retrieved the form element and stored it in the variable node, dot value gets me, in the vast majority of cases, what the user has typed. And if I want to assign to it, I can assign to it as well. If I'm getting numeric input, then I need to use parseInt or parseFloat, the function, to convert the string that I'm going to get. So the value field always returns a string. So if I need it to be a number, if I'm expecting it to be a number, I have to use parseInt and parseFloat. And just be aware that there's a special value called NAMN, not a number. So if I go parseFloat, 45, no problem. I get back the integer 45. If I go parseFloat, something that's not a number, I get back the special value NAN. So if I don't know in advance what x is going to be, I can actually use is NAN x first to find out whether it's kind of backwards logic, but whether it's not a number. So if I need to, I can check to make sure that the user has entered a number that way before I try and parse it, or after I try and parse it. All the mouse events do work, but there's a bunch of other events that we might want to use. So I've covered input or key up. I've covered change event. There's also focus and blur, which I can show you in action. And then there's the submit event. Okay, so let's go and take a look at the actual code for this form, and I'll show you those other events in action. So over in htdocs, I'm in module 3 code, I'm in form examples. So let me open this with JS code, VS Code. And then I'm going to open form example as well. So this is the code for the form. Okay, so it's complicated because there's all these labels and stuff in here, but it's really just, I think, 7 elements, 7 input elements. The user ID, the age, 4 checkboxes, and the submit element here. Okay, over here in form examples, I've got a window add event listener, which is my main method. So this allows me to, all my code goes inside of here. And then I add in, so one thing I'm doing is, wait, let's take a look down here. Oh yeah, here's the one I want to look at first. So there's a focus event and there's a blur event. So here I am I'm going document.forms.exampleform.userid. So that's that first field. And if you remember, if I tab out of this field with something in it, everything's fine. But if I tab out without filling it in, I get an alert. So whenever you go into a form, it triggers a focus event. So focus is the idea that, hopefully you've seen this before, in graphical user interfaces, there's this notion that only one element on the screen at a time will have the focus. And the focus is where keystroke events are sent to, and sometimes you can tell by looking at these items which has focus by the outlining, and so on. So when you click in or tab around the form, different events are getting focus. And when they lose focus, so there's a focus event for that. So for example, I could do, let's do this. Let's add a focus event. So event focus, and I'll just do a console.log focused, like that. So now if I reload this, whenever I click in there, cancel. That's funny. Maybe I'm not looking at the right code. Where am I? Should be in there. Page source. I don't see it there. Aha. Okay, yeah, sometimes things get stuck in the cache. This is actually a good thing that this happened. You'll notice when we first saw it, the focus event wasn't there, but when I hit reload, it was there. So if you make changes and then you don't see them reflected, you may need to force it to reload everything that's cached. And the best way to do that is actually Shift F5 in Chrome. So F5 just reloads. Shift F5 will make sure to load in all the files, including your JavaScript files and stuff like that. So you may need to do that. So now it's working. I tab away, I get one function. I tab back in, I get focused. So if you want to do something whenever the user moves to that form element, you can add it to the focus event. The opposite of focus is blur. Get it? Like if it's a camera, if it's focused, when it goes out of focus, it's blurred. So when this element blurs, that's when we check to see if the user ID field was left blank. So there's blur for that. So we've got blur, we've got focus, we've got input, which I showed you, which is similar to key up, and we've got change. We've looked at how to retrieve form elements. We're getting their values. There is one thing. If you ever end up in a form using radio buttons or checkboxes, so these are input elements as well. This is type checkbox. There's also type radio for radio buttons. They are a little bit different. So if I want to grab this element, I can go let G, or how about R for reading, equal, and this time I'll just do it the normal way, get element by ID. I could go through document.forms, but I think it's CB_reading. Like that. There we go, I got it. So r.value isn't really what we would expect. So this value is the value that will be sent to the server if this form is submitted and that box is checked, then it will send this value. So what's weird about checkboxes is that the user doesn't actually get to set the value. what the user sets is whether it's checked or not. So r.checked is false, and now r.checked is true. And I can uncheck it by setting it to false, and I can recheck it by setting it to true. So these work a little bit differently. And if I have something set up here so that when I unclick this, it says user says they don't like gaming. The way that works is, here it is, document.forms.exampleform cb gaming. I'm adding a change listener on here, so whenever the state of the form element changes, when the input element changes, and then I use this dot checked, and if it's equal to false, I send the alert. Otherwise, I don't. So after the change, if they unclicked it, basically. Okay, one last thing. This form also has a submit event. Now you may or may not decide that you need to use the submit event depending on what you're doing for your form. But one thing that the submit event does is it gives you one last chance to intervene. It creates, so pressing the submit button or hitting enter in one of these text boxes causes a submit event to happen. And you have a chance to kind of intervene with some JavaScript code and decide whether you want the form to actually submit or not. Now, if this is like a one-page app, if this is a standalone JavaScript app, we don't actually ever want this form to be submitted, because if we submit it, it's going to cause a new HTTP request to go somewhere else. If we don't specify in the action attribute where it's going, then it will just reload the page. So one of the things that I've done in the submit event here is I have prevented that from happening. So if we go back here again, finally, the first thing here, I am adding this event listener to the form, not to the submit button or something like that, to the form itself. So the submit event is a form level thing. I'm saying add a listener on submit, and notice I'm getting the event parameter here, which I don't always do. There's a special function you can call, a special method you can call called prevent default. You do this as your very first line, and that will prevent the form element from actually submitting. And then I grab a couple of the fields and I check them. I check over them. So if I remove this command here, what's going to happen is, if we reload the page, when I hit submit, it actually reloads the page. Notice the question mark that's appeared up here. And that's not what I want. Usually if I'm just doing a JavaScript, standalone JavaScript app, I want it to stay on the page. So what you can do is, whenever you create a form, if you want to avoid it from being submitted, at the very least, attach a little stubby listener like this. So grab your form, add a submit event listener that just contains this line. Make sure you get the event here, and just have this line, and that will just make the submit button no longer, or if they hit enter inside a text field, it will no longer submit and reload the page. So that's important if you're doing a standalone JavaScript app. Okay, sorry if the delivery of this was a little haphazard, but that is everything to do with forms and form events. So there's no fundamentally new concepts here, really. We're still just accessing attributes. We're adding function listeners to events and so on. We're retrieving elements from the DOM. Just a few extra things, a few new event types, a new attribute value and also checked, which I showed you, and a new way to retrieve some of the attributes here, some of the elements. That's all we've really added. So there's some exercises for this, and again, we only have 2 videos this week, so I would like you to spend some time doing this. The first one here, I'd like you to try at least one of these. I want you to add some real-time form validation to form examples. Okay, so there's already a bunch of examples there of event listeners that are doing things, but I want you to try 1 or 2 of these. So if the user field becomes blank at any time, so in response to the user just erasing the field or whatever, I want you to somehow highlight it in red. So remember, form elements are just elements. They have border color, they have background color, they have foreground color, and so on. And somewhere on the page, put a red error message, okay, so to let the user know that it's not allowed to be blank. So that's real-time form validation. And then as soon as they type something to make it not blank anymore, you should highlight it in green and remove any error message from the page. Okay, and then there's a bunch of others you can try as well. highlight the gaming field when they uncheck it, make sure the age is correct and a number, and if it's not, highlight it in red, and so on. There's a whole bunch of things here that you can try. So I'd like you to give those a try, one or two of them. And then I'd also like you to try number 2. So there is an arithmetic folder in the code. Here it is, arithmetic. It's just got an index.html, and it's giving you an interface for a little app that's supposed to do arithmetic when you hit the Do It button. So this is a form. If we do a view page source on this, you'll see there's a bunch of CSS, and then there's this form here. It's got a select box with an ID. It's got two number types with IDs and default values. And then it's got an answer value, which has been marked read only. So the idea is that you're just going to put the answer in there. And then a submit button. So what I want you to do is add a listener to this so that when they hit the submit button, it retrieves the items from here. It retrieves the operation from this, this select box. And then it puts the correct answer into this text box here. So it does the operation asked for and puts the answer into that box. So if you want to see it running, of course, there is example code, there is solution code that you could find online. But I would love it if you would try this without looking at the solution code. This is an example of a standalone app, of course. So here we are. Do I have arithmetic? I know I have it, but it's going to be hard to find it, I think. Nope. Nope. Maybe I don't have it. Okay, that's cool. Well, that's fine then. It's not there. So you guys try it. So what should happen again is when you press the button, it should evaluate whatever the user's put here. So if the user dials up 7 minus 2 and I hit do it, I should see 5 appear there. Right now the form's reloading because I don't have a submit event with that event.prevent default on it. So try that. And if you really want to get fancy, there's an extra challenge here. Remove the submit button and just make sure the result is always updated. So get rid of the do it, and whenever I go like this, the answer here changes to match whatever these items are. Or if I change this, the answer here changes. So maybe we'll do some solution code for this in class together. Okay, so I would like you to really roll up your sleeves and do some of this stuff. Try out some of these exercises. There's also this third one if you want to go nuts. That's a cool one too. And when you're satisfied that you know what you're doing, I want you to take a look at this module's assignment. Basically, the assignment is very open. Your task is to create a standalone app, and my idea is that you model it on a game for children. Okay, I have small kids now, so I'm aware of this whole world of apps for children. And what's nice about apps for children is that we can make something pretty simple and still kind of justify it by saying, you know, this is just for kids. So there's a bunch of ideas I've given you for games and puzzles and things like that that we're just going to keep simple. We're going to try and make it look nice, maybe look appealing for kids, and it's all going to run in JavaScript on one page. And you've got a high level of, like the first assignment, you have a high level of freedom of what you want to create. Yeah, you might want to check it with me. But we'll talk about that in the class. So after you've done this, read do these exercises, try them out, read the assignment. If you have any questions, you can email me, but we'll talk about it in class as well. Okay, so I'll see you in class.